Welcome to episode 18 of More Than Words, where we discover that Scotland's most notorious cannibal family was probably just English propaganda with excellent brand recognition, and that modern Sheffield has more microbreweries than the 1980s had functioning steelworks. This week, a cave that may or may not have housed a 1,000-body pickling operation, smugglers who ran contraband like it was a community project, and a Victorian castle where you can now pay £500 a night to be glared at by a falcon who knows it's posher than you. Expect World War II ports built as Liverpool's understudy, oysters that taste like Neptune's perspiration, and the kind of message in a bottle discovery that turns out to be basically an 1817 expenses receipt. Think medieval horror stories meets industrial reinvention meets ferry terminals that occasionally audition for disaster films. Narrated by someone who's just completed the annual Sheffield University reunion pub crawl for the 39th consecutive year, watched his city transform from post-apocalyptic concrete to craft beer theme park, and is now questioning whether a 34-fold increase in bus fares since 1986 means socialism got replaced by surge pricing. This is stage 18. Meet the parents. Okay, so the numbers for this stage. Total distance covered so far is 999 kilometres. Yes, 3 nines, which feels suspiciously close to 1,000 and makes me wonder if I should have walked an extra kilometre just to tick over into 4 digits. That's just under 35% of the entire 2,884 kilometre journey, so we're solidly into the second third now. The time taken in real life was from the 26th of October to the 2nd of November 2025. My current position is 1 day ahead of schedule. So we've lost another day and a half somewhere along the way, which is mildly alarming, but I'm choosing to interpret this as settling into a sustainable pace rather than catastrophically slowing down. IRL. The yeast we can do. This week's tally wasn't so much a concept album as a greatest hits compilation. A couple of local pavement pounding loops, a morning round of golf that mainly involved exploring the rough, 2 long dog walks, largely exercises in leash management and treat negotiation, and the headline act, the annual Sheffield University reunion pilgrimage. The latter is basically 2 pub crawls with 9 old uni mates, repeated faithfully every year for what is now 39 years, if you include the time we were allegedly studying. I use studying in its loosest sense here, as some of the crew did geography degrees. Anyway, 39 years. At this point it's less a tradition and more a collective refusal to accept the concept of middle age. You might expect that nearly 4 decades on we'd be shuffling around the city, sagely nodding at demolished landmarks and muttering, "It's not like it was in my day." But the truth is, Sheffield is in a much better place than it was when we were students. Back in the late 80s, and I say this with love, the city looked like the set of a post-apocalyptic drama with the budget ran out halfway through. The steelworks had collapsed, the Don Valley was basically a scrapyard with planning permission, and the city centre made Soviet concrete look positively aspirational. Unemployment was sky high, optimism was subterranean, and the only thing regenerating was the rust. Fast forward to today, and Sheffield has had the full makeover montage. The Heart of the City project has given it a civic core that no longer looks like it's waiting for the bulldozers. Peace Gardens, the Winter Garden, the Millennium Gallery. Suddenly the centre has somewhere you'd actually arrange to meet someone, not just accidentally pass through on the way to Greg's. The Greater Green scheme has turned dead roads into wildflower catwalks, proving flood defences can double as Instagram backdrops. And Kelham Island, once a graveyard of derelict works, is now a craft beer Disneyland, where you can sip an IPA in the shadow of a Victorian forge and call it heritage. Economically, Sheffield has broadened its horizons into advanced manufacturing, digital industries, and anything with an acronym that sounds futuristic. The universities and the AMRC are flying the flag, proving that cleverness can be a growth industry. Culturally, it's leaned into its past while rebranding itself as the outdoor city, because nothing says urban renaissance like reminding people the Peak District is only 20 minutes away. Sheffield hasn't erased its scars, it's learned to accessorise with them. Once defined by steel, now defined by sustainability. And if you squint, you can almost believe the marketing. Of course, as a 57-year-old looking back 39 years, it would be remiss of me to let a Victor Meldrew moment pass me by. So here goes. In 1986, you could take a bus across Sheffield for 10p. This weekend, it cost me £3.40 on the tram, a 34-fold increase. According to inflation calculators, if subsidised public transport and socialism were still a thing, that trip should now be about 30p. So either the maths is wrong, or Supertram has quietly replaced socialism with surge pricing. And then there's the beer. Back then we'd hunt out real ale spots like the Fat Cat or the Frog and Parrot, nodding in beery solidarity with the kind of camera types who looked like they'd been brewed themselves. But in a lot of late 80s Sheffield pubs, your choice was basically brown or slightly darker brown. You asked what was on, and the landlord would say beer. The foam tasted of despair, the carpets tasted of smoke, and if you wanted variety, you ordered a half. Today, Sheffield could market itself as the beer capital of the world. There are more breweries than bus routes, and every pint comes with a backstory. You can't just order a lager, you have to specify whether you want it dry hopped, double fermented, or brewed in a man's shed in Nether Edge while he hummed Arctic Monkeys B-sides. Back then, a pint in a lot of Sheffield locals was something you endured. Now, a pint is something you Instagram. Then, you drank Ward's Bitter because that's what there was. Now, you can order a mango saison called Hopocalypse now and still complain it's too mainstream. Sheffield has gone from stones to stouts with stories, and if you don't like it, don't worry. There's another microbrewery opening next week in a converted abattoir. 39 years later, the pubs may have changed, the beer certainly has, but our tradition of wandering, talking and laughing through Sheffield remains gloriously intact. Virtual Insanity Stage 18. Sawney Bean's Cave to South Cairn. On with the Virtual Insanity then, which this stage takes us from Sawney Bean's Cave to South Cairn, beginning in exactly the sort of place that makes you wonder if Scotland's Tourism Board actually visits these sites before approving them. Here you'll find legendary cannibals with PR issues, smugglers whose names sound like niche Pokemon, and Victorian baronial castles that will relieve you of £500 a night while calling it heritage. Throw in ferry ports once earmarked as Liverpool's wartime understudy, and enough wind turbines to give Don Quixote a panic attack, and you've got a stretch of coast that refuses to be ordinary. Over the next 35 miles, expect a heady cocktail of spectacular scenery, dark folklore, military contingency planning and industrial ambition, all underscored by the unsettling reminder that Scotland's past has been considerably more violent than its weather. Bon appetit. We begin, inauspiciously, at a cave that has done more for Scotland's reputation than any Visit Scotland brochure ever dared. Sawney Bean's Cave, near Ballantrae, is either the lair of Scotland's most notorious cannibal family or an elaborate 18th century smear campaign against the Scots, depending on which historian you ask and how much they've had to drink. The legend goes like this. Alexander Sawney Bean and his wife Agnes Douglas, sometimes dubbed Black Agnes because medieval Scotland wasn't subtle about nicknames, abandoned polite society sometime in the 16th century and moved to a modest one-up zero-down coastal cave near Banan Head. The cave itself runs nearly 200 metres deep, with an entrance blocked by water at high tide, essentially invisible unless you were specifically looking for a tidal murder cave, which most people weren't. Over the next quarter century, the couple allegedly produced a sprawling brood of over 40 sons, daughters and eventually grandchildren, the latter courtesy of incest because apparently cannibalism alone wasn't lurid enough. The clan supported themselves by ambushing travellers, murdering them and dragging the bodies back to their cave for supper. Leftovers were salted and pickled in barrels, which legend has it occasionally washed up on the nearby beaches, presumably to the considerable distress of anyone out for a pleasant coastal walk. The body count supposedly topped 1,000 before James VI dispatched a posse of 400 men and bloodhounds to the cave. Inside, they allegedly found body parts hanging from the walls, barrels of preserved limbs, and piles of stolen jewellery, essentially a medieval, damp Scottish Chainsaw Massacre. The clan was captured and taken to Edinburgh, where they were executed without trial in a manner so gruesome it makes the Walking Dead look like Teletubbies. The men mutilated and bled to death, the women and children burned alive. Here's the snag though. There's no contemporary evidence any of this actually happened. The earliest written account dates to 1734, over 2 centuries later, in the Newgate Calendar, an English crime anthology not exactly known for its rigorous fact-checking. Think the Daily Mail, but without the comment section that makes you fear for humanity. No Scottish legal records mention the case. No parish registers record the missing 1,000. The whole saga may have been anti-Scottish propaganda, a morality tale about the perils of living outside civilised society, or simply a campfire yarn that spiralled out of control. Even the name Sawney was a common English nickname for Scotsmen, derived from Sandy. In other words, the entire saga may have been one long anti-Scottish pun. Albeit one so lurid, it may have inspired the infamous 1970s video nasty, The Hills Have Eyes. If you don't know what a video nasty is, by the way, ask your parents, or better yet, ask your grandparents. Then ask them if they ever got fined by the video shop for returning a tape without rewinding it. Say hello, cave goodbye. A short distance south brings us to Snib's Cave, also known, depending on who you ask, as Snib's Scots Cave or the Tramp's Cave. It's no modest hollow. The entrance stands 30 feet high and wide, running 70 feet into Banan Head, with a mortared stone wall across the front, a blocked window, and a roof blackened by centuries of fires. Near the Old Coast Road, it was a handy landmark for travellers and, frankly, a decent spot for highway robbery, assuming you didn't mind the pigeons. The floor isn't just sprinkled with droppings, it's carpet bombed. A reminder that the current residents are more interested in cooing and defecating than heritage preservation. Folklore insists the cave was used by smugglers in the 18th and 19th centuries, which makes perfect sense. It's cavernous enough to stash contraband, close enough to the road for a quick getaway, and remote enough that nobody respectable would hang around. And in case you were planning a visit, Google Maps has labelled the pin Snib's Cave, open bracket, not Sawney Beans, close bracket. A disclaimer so nervously specific, it feels like the cave itself is trying to clear its name. Because if there's one thing worse than being a damp, pigeon-infested smuggler's hideout, it's being mistaken for a cannibal cave with a 1,000-body reputation and a fondness for artisanal limb preservation. Gone with the windmill. Southward now to Ballantrae, a coastal village that's somehow internationally famous, despite having fewer than 1,000 residents and very little happening beyond fishing and scenery. Ballantrae owes this fame to Robert Louis Stevenson, who set The Master of Ballantrae here, a novel about the Jacobite Rising, without necessarily visiting, though he may have passed through on a walk, depending on which biographer was more bored that day. Writing in Samoa, because nothing screams authentic Highland grit like hammering it out while sipping a pina colada, Stevenson clearly decided that Ballantrae sounded Scottish enough to get away with it. In the 18th century, Ballantrae Bay was a smuggler's paradise. Large, armed ships known as buckers anchored offshore, unloading barrels of tea, tobacco, brandy and salt under cover of darkness. The work was carried out by lintowers, local men with cutlasses, pistols and an entrepreneurial disregard for taxation. It was less organised crime than community logistics, and the authorities didn't fully stamp it out until troops were sent in the 1780s. Today, Ballantrae has traded contraband for cuisine. Its annual festival of food and drink is considerably less cannibalistic than Sawney Bean would have preferred, celebrating local produce and artisan cooking. You could argue it's basically the same tradition, thankfully with fewer dismemberments and more sourdough. The village still boasts the 1696 windmill, one of Scotland's oldest industrial buildings, and the ruins of Ardstinker Castle, built in the 15th century by Hugh Kennedy of Bargany. The castle was later dismantled for its stone to build a bridge, proof that Scots were upcycling centuries before Instagram made it smug. Britain's Got Talons. Just south of Ballantrae sits Glen App Castle, a Victorian fantasy completed in 1870 and designed by David Bryce, Scotland's go-to architect for anyone who wanted a fortress without the inconvenience of actual warfare. The result is all battlements, crow-stepped gables and sandstone towers, basically Scotland shouting at full volume while wearing the full Highland outfit and daring you to say it looks ridiculous. Later it became home to the Earl of Inchcape, fell into disrepair in the late 20th century and was eventually rescued in the 1990s before reopening as a luxury hotel in 2000. Today you can pay handsomely to stay there, book falconry sessions, essentially paying to be glared at by a bird that knows it's posher than you, and wander gardens partly designed by Gertrude Jekyll, whose surname has condemned her to a lifetime of hide jokes, though her idea of horror was probably a clashing border. The Spin Crowd. Between Smerton, Auchincrosh and Mark, there's frankly not much to detain the casual traveller unless you're compiling a coffee table book titled Minor Turnings Off the A77. Smerton is basically a bend in the road that learned to keep its head down. Auchincrosh feels like the kind of place that might once have had a shop but thought better of it. And Mark, well, that looks suspiciously like someone told the cartographer to just put a mark there and they took it literally. Collectively, they feel like the appendix of the A77, technically part of it, but nobody's entirely sure why it exists. Glen App Wind Farm to the east is where the weather finally gets monetised. A hillside of turbines now converts relentless Ayrshire gusts into clean energy and the smug glow of renewable virtue. From a distance they look oddly serene, like a formation of polite alien invaders admiring the view before colonising Cairnryan. Not everyone approves, of course. The current US president famously claimed wind turbines cause cancer, which is about as credible as his golf handicap. Personally, I find it oddly reassuring. After centuries of cursing the wind, Scotland has at last found a way to invoice it. Peer pressure. Cairnryan is a village that has spent 3 centuries reinventing itself, usually because someone else told it to. It started in 1701 with Loch Ryan House, then pottered along for 200 years as a staging post on the coach road to Ayr. There was a slate quarry, half a dozen inns, and a reputation for highwaymen, which is a polite way of saying don't hang around unless you enjoy being mugged. Then came World War II, and peace and quiet were cancelled indefinitely. The Admiralty decided Cairnryan would make an ideal number 2 military port, which sounds faintly like a plumbing euphemism, but actually meant backup for Liverpool and the Clyde in case they explode. Between 1941 and 1943, 3 enormous piers, a military railway, and miles of infrastructure were built to handle Atlantic convoys. When the war ended, Cairnryan became a parking lot for defeated submarines. Under Operation Deadlight, surrendered German U-boats were herded into Loch Ryan before being towed out and scuttled in the North Channel. Afterwards, the port pivoted again, this time to ammunition disposal. Lorries marked Davy Jones' locker Cairnryan trundled to the shore, an address that sounds romantic until you realise it meant we're dumping explosive in the ocean and hoping Poseidon's insurance covers it. By the 1970s, the military had gone, and Cairnryan reinvented itself yet again, this time as a ferry port. P&O opened a roll-on roll-off service to Larne in 1973, and Stena Line followed with its Belfast terminal in 2011. Today, Cairnryan handles over 1.5 million passengers annually, which means if you're driving from Scotland to Northern Ireland, you're going through Cairnryan whether you like it or not. The village itself remains tiny and largely defined by its ferries, occasionally surfacing in the news whenever the weather decides to audition for a disaster film. In 2018, for instance, high winds topple lorries on deck mid-crossing, proof that in Cairnryan, even the cargo is desperate to disembark. And now it's our turn to board the Larne ferry, wave a damp goodbye to Scotland, and watch the shoreline vanish into the mist. After almost 1,000 kilometres, it feels like the end of an era, or at least the end of a long car park with a pier attached. Still, the symbolism is there. One country behind us, another waiting on the far shore, and somewhere in between, visit Scotland exhaling with relief that we're now officially Northern Ireland's problem. Shook and awe. Loch Ryan is one of those geographical overachievers that insist on being called a loch when, in reality, it's just a sea in a wig. 8 miles long, 3 miles wide, and cosily sheltered from the elements, it's less a loch and more a perfectly shaped parking bay for ferries, the aquatic equivalent of a motorway service station, only without the consolation of a Greggs cheese and onion pasty. For centuries, it's done what it does best, sitting there, flat and benign, while humans project their ambitions onto it. The Romans may have used it as a harbour, which technically makes it a transport hub before transport was even a concept. By the 17th century, cattle and horses were being shipped across from Ireland, a tradition that evolved via postal services, industrial stubbornness and the occasional sinking into today's ferry corridor. Naturally, there's a lighthouse, built in 1847 at Cairn Point by Alan Stevenson, because if there's a lighthouse anywhere near Scottish coastline, we already fully understand that a Stevenson's been there with a flask and a clipboard. Beneath its beam, the loch once teemed with oysters, skate, flounder and cod, though by the 19th century the herring had largely packed up and left. Loch Ryan's native oysters, Ostrea edulis, are the last commercially harvested beds of their kind in Scotland, and they know it. They sit there, filtering seawater and radiating superiority, like Simon Cowell in a shell. Eating one is less a meal than a confrontation. You prise open the shell, it glares back, and then you're expected to tip it down your throat while pretending this is perfectly normal behaviour. The traditional advice is to swallow them whole, but that feels like cheating, as if you've paid good money to perform a sword-swallowing act with added brine. Chew them though, and you're rewarded with a taste somewhere between the sea, a rock pool, and the faint suspicion you've just licked Neptune's armpit. And here's the thing, I actually like them. There's something perversely satisfying about the ritual, the salt, the chill, the feigned sense of being judged by your lunch. It's not just food, it's performance art with a seawater garnish, and Loch Ryans are amongst the most celebrated in Scotland. Been there, done that. It's at this point we start leaning harder on artistic licence. Without it, the rest of this stage, and most of the next, would read simply, yep, still in the North Channel. So once again we raise the binoculars and see what can be dragged into focus from the ferry. As the ship leaves Cairnryan, the portside offers up Cocom and Carswell at the northern end of the Rins of Galloway, a hammerhead peninsula dangling into the Irish Sea like Scotland trying to jab Northern Ireland with a stick. Cocom's name, from Kilcolum, Church of Columba, is both its etymology and, frankly, its main claim to fame. It briefly made headlines in 2020 when locals rallied to save their post office, proof that in rural Scotland, stamps can inspire more devotion than saints. Beyond that, Cocom mostly exists to remind us that not every hamlet gets cliff-top cannibal caves. Some just get a church, a saintly name, and a very determined queue for Amazon parcels. Carswell sits a little further on, best known for its lighthouse, which, in a plot twist no one saw coming, isn't in the village at all, but 4 miles away on the tip of the peninsula, exactly where a lighthouse should be earning its keep. Built in 1817 by Robert Stevenson, because, as is now becoming exceedingly tedious, if there's a tall stone thing with a light on it anywhere north of Berwick, as Stevenson almost certainly signed the invoice, it has guarded the entrance to Loch Ryan for over 2 centuries. In its heyday, the beam reached 22 nautical miles, which was excellent news for sailors and considerably less so for smugglers who preferred their coastline to be a little more ambiguous. During restoration in 2024, a message in a bottle was found behind one of its walls. Exciting, until you learn it was basically a note saying who installed the lantern and what materials they used. So less buried treasure, more expenses receipt. Today the light still flashes, though most of the building now operates as a hotel, offering the rare thrill of being almost shipwrecked but with room service and a wine list. Tied and tested. We finish at Barnhills, North Cairn and South Cairn, proof that not every place in Scotland hides a saga. Sometimes it's just a hill, a cairn, and another cairn a short walk down the road. They mark the end of our route, where Loch Ryan spills into the Firth of Clyde and Scotland finally runs out of coastline to fling at the Irish Sea. Stage 18 has taken us from cannibal caves, probably fictional, through smuggling villages, definitely real, past Victorian castles, eye-wateringly expensive, World War II ports, historically significant, and ferry terminals, perpetually irritating. It's 35 miles of Scotland at its most contradictory. Beautiful yet brutal, historic yet industrial, romantic yet pragmatic, legendary yet stubbornly mundane. Welcome to South Cairn. Ireland's that way. Try not to eat the locals. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.